We're finally getting started on our poured concrete countertops. In today's video, we'll be showing you the entire process we followed from start to finish. We're doing things a little different. We really feel like we've made some innovations in the process, including the type of forms we used and the edging, and also the finishing techniques. So stay with us to see how we did it and how it turned out.
This is Red and April off-grid. We are building a completely off-the-grid home and doing all of the work ourselves.
The first thing we need to do is get a good base to pour this concrete on. We're going to be pouring it in place, and so I needed a good sturdy base to hold the weight of the concrete. I decided to use 1/2-inch plywood, and so here I am just cutting it to size and getting it fitted in. I also needed to install some additional supports in this corner since there's no cabinet there, so I used my level to create a line that just extends the level of the cabinets across, to put in some support boards there. And with that done, I can put my plywood in place and do some test fitting. I wanted to bring some metal into this build here, and so what we decided to do is use a metal edging that will stay in place permanently and show, so the edge of our countertops will be metal. So I think that'll look really nice. And in order to do that, I'm attaching a piece of aluminum that will show on the outside, but it'll also be part of the form for when we pour the concrete, and it'll just stay in place permanently. So I think this will work out really well. I'm just using some 2x2 angled aluminum, and I'm attaching that to the bottom of that plywood that I'm using as a form. I had to think a little bit about how to make this connection where the two metal pieces come and make a corner. I wanted it to be a good solid connection, and it has to be able to bear the weight of the concrete as we're pouring it in, as we're smoothing it out. So it needs to be a good strong joint. And of course, anything I do to attach it will be visible since it's all staying in place. And so I decided to use rivets. I cut a little angle iron piece that I put inside and then drilled through the outside and that angle iron piece inside, and then put a rivet through both pieces. So the rivets make a really nice strong connection, and I think they're also attractive. They add a little bit to that kind of aeronautical industrial theme. So they look nice, and they should work really well and make a nice strong corner. I did have quite a few of these corner sections to do since we're doing 3 countertop sections. There's the main countertop and the kitchen area with the sink and everything. Then there's a separate and detached countertop over by the fridge, and another one in the master closet. I ran out of metal towards the end, and so on the piece that will go in the master closet, I just decided to use a piece of plywood for one of the sides, which worked out just fine. So here I am just running the rivets from the aluminum support brace in the middle, just through the side of the plywood. With the countertop forms prefabbed, I just needed to do a little bit more work to these countertops to get them all as level as I possibly could. So I got the sander and went over everything. Then I applied some construction adhesive to the edges, and we set the countertop in place. I did use a few screws to attach that as well, and then I moved on to some of those corners. There were a few more that I needed to do, so here I am putting in that corner piece and riveting those in place. With the base/form finished up, it was time to move on to the sink. I needed to cut a hole in the cabinet for the sink, and so I'm getting out the sink and doing some measurements. It did come with a template to mark out, but the template was totally wrong. It was completely worthless, sadly. And so I measured a bunch of times and had to figure it out for myself how big to make this. It was a little challenging because there's some clips that need to go on the inside, and I need to make room for those clips to be able to get those on. And like I say, the guide that they gave me was totally worthless, but I figured it out and got the hole cut out for the sink. We didn't get any footage of it, but I just marked it out with pencil and cut it out with the power saw. I then used some plywood to create a lip or a form for the concrete all around where the sink goes. I just cut a piece of 1/2-inch plywood 2 inches high and stapled it to the edge. I'm coating everything with a polyurethane sealer, so I'm coating the base and the inside edge of the aluminum strip to protect the wood from the moisture and to protect the aluminum strip from the corrosive effects of the concrete. Here's a look at the little separate side piece over by the fridge. Next up was adding the wire mesh reinforcement. So this is a 6x6 pattern. It's a nice heavy gauge wire that's crimped along the edge, kind of like rebar, so that the concrete really bonds to it and holds to it really well. And so what I'm doing is just cutting it roughly to size and then bending over the edges about a 1/2 inch down so that it will hold itself up off the surface of the countertop and end up being a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of the way up into the concrete layer. This wire worked out perfect. It's really rigid, so it holds itself in place and holds itself up off the base. Worked out really well. We're using a Quickrete countertop mix for this, and we're just getting ready to start mixing it outside and do our first batch. We'll be starting on the little section in the master closet as our experimental try here. And so here we are putting it in. It goes in really thick. It's an interesting consistency. It's not very liquid. This felt like it was maybe a little too dry. But, once we got it squished in and kind of spread in a little bit, we really liked the way it worked. And so we put in a little bit, got it worked down through the wire layer, and now we're putting in the rest, filling it up. April's doing a little tamping on the side there to try to work the bubbles out. And now she's using the Quickrete to go across the top and get the top roughly level. One thing you can't really see here, but it's important, is I glued a piece of plywood, just a thin piece. It's 3/16 plywood. I cut a piece to the same height as the countertop and glued it along that far wall. And so that's what we're resting the Quickrete on that side up against the wall. There's actually a little piece of wood that creates a little ledge that we're able to use as support for the Quickrete on that side. And that worked out really good. That piece will also stay in place. It won't be visible once there's a backsplash on, but it allows us to use the Quickrete to get it flat. Once the screeding was done, I had a nice flat surface to work on, and the trelling went really well. That first piece went well, and now we're moving on to the little section in the kitchen over by the fridge. We've got that filled up with cement, and we're starting to work it down. Here we can just put a board, across both of those aluminum edges, and that makes the perfect flat spot for the Quickrete. So we Quicreted those off, got it as flat as possible with the Quickrete, and now we're working with the trowel. Seems to be working well. If there's a low spot, I'm just adding a little bit of cement and working that in, trying to kind of fill it up until it completely fills up that aluminum form, and then just smooth it all down. This Quickrete mix is interesting. It went in really thick, kind of like peanut butter, and so we were afraid that it would dry really fast and we wouldn't have much work time, but that's not the case. It turns out that even though it went in thick, it's drying really slowly, which is nice. And so we have a lot of time to work it. We're not sure how much we should work it, but we just worked it for a good while. We tamped it several times, trying to work the bubbles out and get it as smooth as possible. Here we've let it sit for about 30 minutes and we're coming back, and so I'm in the master closet here working this one down. I did this a few times, let it set and then come back to it, and it changed a little bit. Every 30 minutes I'd come back and do it again, and I felt like every time I was able to get it just a little bit better, just a little smoother. It had set up a little bit more, got a little bit harder, but you could still work the surface. And so I think I did that cycle 3 or 4 times until I felt like I had achieved the best surface possible and it was getting too dry. We let that dry overnight, and the next day we were ready to start the large countertop section. So you can see I'm bringing in the cement mixer here. Yesterday we used the buckets to mix everything, and we were able to do half a bag at a time in the bucket, but it was overheating my drill. It was really hard mixing, and it took a long time because you have to mix for like 5 minutes. And so in today's cabinet section, we need over 6 bags, and I started doing the math and figured we would be mixing for over an hour just in mix time, and I knew my drill couldn't stand up to it. So we knew we needed to do something different. So we pulled out the big cement mixer. We're a little worried because it's going to be completely different using the mixer. We're worried about getting the consistency right. In the bucket, we were able to add the amount of water very precisely. But in the mixer, it seems like the sides of the mixture take up a lot of moisture and it doesn't mix as well. So we're concerned, but we feel like that's what we have to do. So we're going for it. We were able to do 2 whole bags in the mixer at a time, so that really sped up the process. It was difficult to mix. We had to mess with it a lot. I had to stop it and stir it by hand some, and we had to add more water than it called for, a little bit more water. But it does seem to be working out and really is the only way we could do it. So we've mixed up that first batch and we're putting that into the form here, working that through the rebar, and this is all going along pretty well. April helps me to work it in and get it flat, and then I'm going back outside to start another batch. Doing this big section was definitely more difficult than yesterday. It was definitely more stressful. We were really working hard and it felt like we were racing the clock to get this done. Definitely needed both of us. April was able to work the concrete while I was outside mixing, fighting with that mixer. That was challenging. And she was working very hard in here, screeding and leveling. But between the both of us, we were able to get it done. I would definitely not want to try it alone. At this point here, we have pretty much everything mixed, and April has done most of the screeding, so we're about to get to leveling here. I'm just starting to work it back and forth. You can see I'm adding some material here, just trying to fill up my forms completely. I don't want it to be low. And so I'm just beginning the process of leveling it out, getting enough material, getting it all smooth, and working it back and forth with my trowel. I will say that this material is quite thick and kind of challenging to mix. It really is a lot like peanut butter and has a lot that same consistency. So it's not as watery as normal concrete. It has a lot of stabilizers and plasticizers in it. But it was a little bit challenging to work, at least to get it smooth and flat and level and to the right height. But once you did get it to kind of that finishing stage, then I felt like it finished really well, like better than most concrete would. Those stabilizers and everything brought it all to the top, and it just seemed to be easier to get it perfectly smooth and flat. Now, I had originally wanted to use a material that was very liquidy, something that just kind of flowed into the crevices and self-leveled, but I really couldn't find anything out there on the market like that. This Quickrete product seemed like an easy-to-get, ready-mix product. It was available at the local hardware store. It was highly recommended, and so we decided to use it, and we're glad we did. It seemed to have worked out well. Whew, this has been a serious workout, but it's turning out really nice, better than I would have expected, actually. It feels really smooth and level. We took a break, and we're coming back after lunch here, actually, so we've let it sit for a while, 30-45 minutes, and now I'm just going over it again carefully with the trowel, trying to get a little bit better, smoother surface. This material is still quite workable, even after it's set for a little while, and so you can still work out some small bubbles. You can still get it a little bit flatter and just get that finish a little bit better. So just like I did on the other ones, I went through several cycles of letting it sit for about 30 minutes and then coming back and working it over with the trowel until I just felt like it was the best I could get it, and it was starting to dry up to the point where it didn't want to work anymore, and so that's where I left it. We wanted to try wet sanding as a finishing technique to see how that worked, and so on these first two pieces it's been 24 hours, and we decided to do a little wet sanding. So I've just applied some water and I'm sanding it down here, and it really seems to be helping. It's taken out those small blemishes, those little lines from the trowel, and it's really smoothing everything out really nicely. I'm just using a medium grit sandpaper. It's recommended that you use wet or dry. I didn't have any, so I'm just using a regular sandpaper, and it actually seems to work fine. I'm changing it out fairly often. As you're sanding, it creates a nice slurry that you kind of work into the surface, and then once you wipe all that off, it leaves a nice clean surface. We really like how this turned out. It's smooth, and we like the appearance of the surface. It's got some different colors and looks real nice. I then wet the countertop down again and covered it to help with the curing process. Since it's only been 24 hours, we'll try to keep it covered for a few days, help keep the moisture in. We use that plastic. Also putting some plastic and stuff on the countertop that we did earlier in today, just to keep that moisture in and help it cure strong. Well, it's the next day, and we've uncovered the main countertop and allowed the water that was on the surface to dry a little bit, and it leaves an interesting texture. You see it's really gray, almost looks like a gray paint on the top is the natural surface that it left. I don't know if it's all those plasticizers and stuff, but it left an interesting appearance, so we're hoping this sanding that we do helps. So I'm just starting my wet sanding here, and I have on, like say, medium grit. I think it's about 120 grit is what I'm using here. I just have the Velcro hook pad that's attached to a little hand sander there, and this is working out great. It's perfect just to do it by hand. You don't need a machine here because it would just throw water everywhere. This way I can keep it fairly clean. It's another nice thing about doing the wet sanding. It's actually a pretty clean process. It doesn't make a big mess, which is nice. As you can see, I'm not going too crazy in this. I'm just wetting it down, going by hand in a kind of a circular pattern, moving over, but I'm not spending an incredible amount of time. It actually seems to work pretty quickly. You just work it, it builds up a slurry. I'm coming back and doing a little bit more, but I'm not spending a ton of time on this. It's a pretty fast process. Once it's sanded down, I have to clean it off, and it takes a little bit to get that slurry off. So I'm just re-wetting my rag and trying to go over it several times so that I get all of the slurry off, get it nice and clean, and then leave it to dry. Now moving on to the back half of the countertop. One thing that worked out really good is when you're doing this wet sanding, I was able to blend it in with that lip of the aluminum edge. So I basically just sanded it down until I started sanding down the top of that aluminum lip, and so I was able to get a perfectly smooth transition from the cement to that aluminum edge, and that worked out really great. I'm really pleased at how that's working out. There's really no crack there or gap in between, and it's a nice level transition. This is coming along really nicely. I will mention that the total thickness of the concrete is 1.5 inches, which I think is a fairly standard thickness for concrete countertops. Once the wet sanding was finished, we decided to go ahead and remove the tape and clean up the edge of the aluminum. We figured we had a little concrete between the tape and the aluminum, especially along that top edge there, and so we decided just to remove it all and get the aluminum cleaned up right now. Well, the tape worked out well. It protected most of the aluminum edging, everything except for probably that top 1/8 of an inch or so, where there is some concrete on there. So I'm going to have to get that off of there somehow. Tried kind of washing it a little bit. That wasn't working too well. I got some of it off, but there was still some kind of persistent crust that was on there. And so I actually got out my pocket knife and used that to scrape it off, and then went over that with some sandpaper to smooth out the scratches I'd made with my pocket knife, and that actually worked out really well. I just made sure when I was using that sandpaper to go with the grain of the metal, and it turned out really nice. We let the countertops dry for about a week, and we were ready to apply the sealer. We're going to be using a Tung Oil sealer on these, but they were still a little bit rough. They were smooth overall, but a little rough to the touch. Like there were tiny little particles that were sharp and sticking up, and I really didn't feel like the sandpaper would do any good there. Felt like the sandpaper wasn't strong enough to cut the tops off of those sand particles. And so we decided to use a stone in order to get that top perfectly smooth and soft to the touch. And when you use a stone, it works really well to use oil with the stone, and so we decided to combine both of these steps and do a Tung Oil stoning. We had never seen anyone do this, but it seemed like it would work really well, so we just bought a stone that's used for sharpening knives, basically. And then we applied this Tung Oil, which will be the sealer. It's just Tung Oil cut with a little bit of orange citrus solvent, and applied the Tung Oil really thick and started going over it with the stone. So I went back and forth, used circular patterns, and just worked the stone like sandpaper, going over this and working it in. I had to apply oil several more times because it's really thirsty. It's absorbing that oil. But this worked really good. So it made a little bit of a cream that mixed in and filled in the fine pores. The stone is a really hard surface, and so it was able to knock off the top of the sand particles and stone particles. It really fine-tuned the surface and made it much smoother. The following day, we were ready to move on to the main countertop area, so I'm just removing the plastic, and we're almost ready to apply the sealer here, but before I did that, I needed to do some work in the sink area. Around the sink was the only area that we had any forms that needed to be removed. I had to build this lip to keep the concrete from going into this hole, and so I had to remove these 1/2-inch plywood pieces. I tried to make them as easy to remove as possible. They weren't really well secured. Tried to make them easy to come off, and so far they're coming off pretty well. This one came off too, but unfortunately it did crack right there in the middle when I was pulling these off. Even though they came off pretty easy, it just snapped and a hairline cracked, opened up in the middle. But on the plus side, maybe, that relief of tension will keep the other corners from cracking out, I hope. We liked the way that the oil stoning worked on the other countertops, really left a nice surface, so we wanted to do that again on this one. So doing that here, just applying a good heavy coat of oil and working it with the stone. It will start drying out and getting hard to move the stone. The stone will start sticking, and when that starts happening, just need to add some more oil. Keep plenty of oil in there, keep working that slurry around, and keep it really wet. It's great for the countertop, gives it plenty of oil, allows it to soak in all of that good oil as possible. And this is working out really nice, creating a nice surface. We had wondered whether we would need to go over this countertop surface with some kind of a filler. We've seen a lot of people do that when they pour it in a form and then flip it over. There would be small cavities on the backside that they would need to fill in with the filler, and we thought maybe we'd have to do that, but we didn't need to. Pouring it in place and then doing these two techniques working in that slurry and everything and doing the wet sand and then the stone grind, we haven't had really any porosity that's needed to be filled in. There's absolutely no need for a filler. This really turned out nice and smooth. We really love the color variation as well. Now that we're done with the messy steps of the countertop application and actually with all the other messy jobs that we had to do in the house, we're finally ready to remove the plastic and the paper from the concrete floors. It's great to finally see these concrete floors again, and it's cool to see them with the concrete countertops. They really go wonderfully together. We're really happy that we decided to go with the concrete countertops. We always wanted them, but I was really intimidated by the process, and I wasn't sure that I could do it successfully. I wasn't sure that they would turn out. And so in fact, at times I thought about going with more of a butcher block countertop instead, because I was just worried that the concrete wouldn't work out. But we decided to bite the bullet. We knew it was the best for our house. It went with our design, and so we went for it, and we're really happy with how it turned out. After sweeping it off and getting it nice and clean, we decided to apply another coat of sealer to the concrete surface. We learned in the bathroom that when you pull off that tape from the plastic and the paper, that it removes a little bit of the sealer, and so we wanted to freshen up the protective layer. Well, it's been a few days and I'm coming back in to apply another coat of this Tung Oil. This isn't a messy process. Thankfully, I'd still have to be careful not to slop some over the edge and make a mess on the floor, but if you're careful, it's not a messy step, and I'm just applying another coat, letting it soak in as much as possible. So we decided to use Tung Oil as a sealer here because Tung Oil is a natural oil, it's a food-safe oil, and it's a polymerizing oil that sets up and forms a water-resistant barrier. I've been applying this nice and wet and letting it set for about 30 minutes and then wiping off the excess. And we plan to do this every day until the cabinets stop absorbing the oil. We expect it to take 3 or 4 applications. Something that we noticed after the second and third coats is that you start to see more color variation in the concrete. I think it's because the oil soaks in a little bit more in some areas than in others, and so you start to see more light and dark contrasts in the surface of the concrete, which we really liked. It just gives it more interest and created a very interesting surface. We ended up giving it 4 applications, and that seemed to be plenty, and now we'll let it dry for several weeks before moving on to the next treatment. This is natural Tung Oil, and so it takes a good while to dry. Once it's completely dry, we'll add a layer of wax to the surface to finish it off. We did remove the tape from around the back edge, and it's all smudged up and stuff, and it's kind of bothering me, but we will be adding a backsplash, of course, so all that'll be all covered up. And you can get a good look here at the color variation that you see in the cement. I hadn't expected so much variation, so much interest in the texture and the tone of a concrete countertop. Overall, this turned out amazing. It turned out way better than I thought possible. I just didn't have that much confidence in my ability to make a concrete countertop that was flat and smooth and attractive, but we really wanted one and we decided to try it, and it turned out way better than I thought. We're really pleased with it. This is made for a very sleek and beautiful and affordable countertop. Our cost total for this project, including the cement, the reinforcement wire, the metal strips, the plywood, the finishing oil, everything involved is $415 total. And that's for 17 linear feet of countertop.
Thank you for watching, and join us again next Saturday morning for more of our DIY home build.